In the static grey of a traffic-free morning, a luxury car brakes in front of an abandoned school. The man behind the wheel, in an impeccable suit, opens the back door and pulls out a weakened German Shepherd by its collar. Without a word, he leaves the dog at the rusty gate and drives away without looking back. Amidst broken glass, a baby crawls across the dusty floor, abandoned there hours before. The dog drags itself over to the baby and lies down beside it. The two remain together, motionless in the dark. Outside, not even the pigeons dare to move. And then someone approaches the gate. Love stories with animals. Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for following us. Now, back to our story. In the heart of Cedar Falls, North Carolina, where time seemed to move slower and mornings still carried the scent of fresh bread and neighborly conversations, an abandoned elementary school stood like a forgotten memory of what once was. Roosevelt Elementary had been closed for over a decade, its broken windows and peeling paint hiding decades of childhood stories, laughter, and dreams. The old brick building sat on Maple Street, surrounded by towering oak trees whose branches had grown wild and untamed, creating shadows that danced across the cracked pavement. The playground equipment, once bright and inviting, now rusted in silence, swings moving gently in the morning breeze like ghosts of playtime past. On this particular Thursday morning in late September, something unexpected was about to unfold at Roosevelt Elementary. The autumn air carried a crispness that promised changing seasons, and the leaves were just beginning to show hints of gold and amber. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who lived in the pale yellow house directly across from the school, was tending to her garden when she noticed something unusual. A sleek, black luxury sedan pulled up slowly to the curb in front of the school's rusted gates. The car was pristine, clearly expensive, and seemed completely out of place in this humble neighborhood where pickup trucks and older sedans were the norm. Mrs. Patterson paused in her gardening, her weathered hands still holding a handful of dried marigold seeds as she watched the scene unfold. The driver emerged first. He was a tall man in his 50s, wearing an impeccable charcoal gray suit that looked like it cost more than most people in Cedar Falls made in a month. His hair was perfectly styled, silver at the temples, and his face wore an expression of cold determination. Everything about him screamed wealth and power, yet there was something deeply unsettling in his demeanor. Mrs. Patterson found herself holding her breath as the man moved with calculated precision to the rear passenger door. When he opened it, what she saw next made her heart skip a beat. He reached inside and pulled out a thick leather leash, attached to which was a German Shepherd that was clearly in distress. The dog was magnificent despite his obvious suffering. His coat, though dulled by illness, still showed traces of the rich browns and blacks that marked him as a purebred. But his eyes, oh his eyes, spoke of pain and confusion. He limped heavily on his right front paw, and with each breath came a harsh cough that echoed in the quiet morning air. Yet despite his physical suffering, there was something in those dark eyes that reached for compassion, for understanding, for just one gentle touch. Mrs. Patterson watched in growing horror as the man in the suit showed no tenderness, no emotion whatsoever. He simply led the suffering animal to the front gates of the abandoned school and dropped the leash. The German Shepherd looked up at him with those pleading eyes, his tail giving the faintest attempt at a wag, as if hoping this was all some terrible mistake. But the man had already turned his back. Without a word, without even a glance over his shoulder, he strode back to his car with the same cold precision he had shown in arriving. The engine purred to life, and within moments, the luxury sedan was disappearing down Maple Street, leaving behind only the fading scent of expensive leather and the devastating reality of abandonment. The German Shepherd stood there for several long minutes, staring in the direction the car had gone. His ears were perked forward, listening for any sound that might indicate his person was coming back. When none came, he let out a soft whine that carried such heartbreak that Mrs. Patterson felt tears spring to her eyes. She started to move toward her garden gate, intending to help the poor creature, when something else caught her attention. From somewhere within the abandoned school building came another sound entirely. It was faint at first, almost lost in the rustle of autumn leaves, but unmistakable once she focused on it. It was the cry of a baby. Mrs. Patterson froze, her hand on the gate latch. There couldn't be a baby inside Roosevelt Elementary. The building had been sealed up tight for years. The city had made sure of that after too many teenagers had tried to use it as a hangout spot. Yet the sound came again, clearer this time, and definitely from inside the old school. The German Shepherd heard it too. Despite his obvious pain and exhaustion, something in that cry seemed to call to him. He lifted his head, ears swiveling toward the sound, and began to move. His limp was pronounced, each step clearly causing him discomfort, yet he pressed forward with determination that spoke to something deeper than mere animal instinct. Mrs. Patterson watched in amazement as the dog found a gap in the chain-link fence that surrounded the school property. It was barely wide enough for him to squeeze through, and the effort clearly cost him, but he managed it. Once on the school grounds, he made his way toward what used to be the main entrance. Following his nose and ears toward the source of that crying, the baby's cries had stopped by the time the German Shepherd reached the building, but somehow he knew exactly where to go. There, near what had once been the kindergarten wing, a ground-level window had been broken out years ago and never properly boarded up. The opening was just large enough for the dog to crawl through, though again, the effort was clearly painful. Mrs. Patterson stood at her garden gate, her heart pounding with a mixture of concern and disbelief. She had lived across from Roosevelt Elementary for over 30 years. She had watched it flourish as a center of childhood joy and learning, and she had mourned when it was finally closed. Never in all that time had she witnessed anything like what was unfolding before her eyes. The crying had resumed from within the building, but now it was softer, more like fussing than distress, and somehow Mrs. Patterson could swear she heard other sounds too, gentle sounds, comforting sounds, the kind of sounds a protective parent might make to soothe a frightened child. But there was no parent in there. There was only an abandoned, suffering dog and a baby who, by all logic, should not have been there at all. As the morning sun climbed higher and the sounds from within the school grew quieter, Mrs. Patterson found herself faced with a decision. Should she call the police? Animal control? Social services? Or should she wait and see what developed? Something deep in her heart told her that whatever was happening inside Roosevelt Elementary was beyond the scope of normal explanations, and perhaps beyond the reach of normal solutions. She decided to wait, to watch, and to trust that whatever force had brought these two abandoned souls together might know better than any human authority what was truly needed. Little did Mrs. Patterson know that her decision to wait would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just the lives of the unlikely pair inside the school, but the entire community of Cedar Falls itself. Inside the dusty corridors of Roosevelt Elementary, filtered sunlight streamed through broken windows, casting dancing shadows across abandoned classrooms that still held traces of their former life. Alphabet charts hung crooked on walls, and forgotten crayons lay scattered across floors that hadn't heard the patter of little feet in over a decade. In what had once been the kindergarten reading corner, a remarkable scene was unfolding. The German Shepherd, whose name tag had long since worn away, had discovered the source of the crying. Nestled in a pile of old blankets near the corner where the cozy reading nook used to be, was a baby who couldn't have been more than 8 months old. The child was clearly a little boy, with tufts of light brown hair and the biggest, most alert brown eyes the dog had ever seen. His clothes were clean but simple, suggesting he had been cared for recently. Though how he had ended up alone in this abandoned building remained a mystery that would have puzzled anyone who might have witnessed the scene. What happened next defied every expectation about the relationship between a suffering animal and a vulnerable infant. Instead of being frightened by the large dog's appearance, the baby seemed to recognize a kindred spirit. His crying softened to curious whimpers as the German Shepherd approached slowly, carefully, as if he understood the precious nature of his discovery. The dog was clearly in pain, his breathing was labored, and his injured paw made every movement a challenge. Yet somehow, in the presence of this tiny human who had also been left behind, he found reserves of strength and gentleness that surprised even himself. He settled down beside the makeshift bed, positioning his warm body between the baby and the cold autumn air that seeped through the broken windows. The baby, with the fearless curiosity that only the very young possess, reached out his tiny hand and touched the dog's snout. The German Shepherd closed his eyes at the contact, and for the first time since his abandonment, his tail moved in what might have been the beginning of a wag. It was as if these two abandoned souls recognized something in each other that transcended species, age, and circumstance. Hours passed in this quiet companionship. The dog dozed fitfully, one ear always alert for any sign of danger, while the baby seemed remarkably content given his unusual circumstances. When the child grew fussy, the dog would shift position to provide better shelter. When the baby seemed cold, the German Shepherd would move closer, sharing his body heat without ever being asked. Meanwhile, across the street, Mrs. Patterson was struggling with her conscience. She had spent the morning pacing her living room, alternating between reaching for her phone to call for help and stopping herself, held back by an inexplicable feeling that she needed to understand what was happening before involving the authorities. By afternoon, she had decided she needed reinforcements in the form of someone she trusted implicitly. Mrs. Patterson picked up her phone and called her dear friend Margaret Collins, a retired teacher who had actually worked at Roosevelt Elementary for nearly 20 years before its closure. "Margaret, I need you to come over here," Mrs. Patterson said, trying to keep the urgency out of her voice. "There's something happening at the old school that I think you need to see." Margaret Collins arrived within 30 minutes, her silver hair pulled back in its characteristic neat bun, wearing the comfortable walking shoes that had served her well through decades of chasing after energetic students. At 72, she still moved with the purposeful stride of someone who had spent her career managing classrooms full of children. "Eleanor, what on earth has gotten into you?" Margaret asked as she followed her friend to the garden gate. "You sounded positively mysterious on the phone." Mrs. Patterson pointed toward the school building. "This morning, a man in an expensive car abandoned a sick German Shepherd right at the front gates. The dog was clearly suffering. Margaret, limping, coughing, just heartbreaking to watch." Margaret frowned. Her teacher instincts immediately engaged. "Did you call animal control?" "Wait, there's more," Mrs. Patterson continued. "I heard a baby crying from inside the school. The dog heard it too, and somehow he got inside to help. They've been in there together all day." Margaret stared at her friend with a mixture of disbelief and concern. "Eleanor, are you feeling all right? A baby inside Roosevelt Elementary? That's impossible. The building has been sealed for years." "I know how it sounds," Mrs. Patterson said firmly, "but I know what I saw and heard. That dog is in there with a baby, and somehow they're taking care of each other." Margaret studied her friend's face and saw the conviction there. Eleanor Patterson had been her neighbor and friend for over 15 years, and she had never known her to make up stories or imagine things that weren't there. If Eleanor said there was a baby in the old school, then there probably was. "What do you think we should do?" Margaret asked finally. Before Mrs. Patterson could answer, they heard a sound that made both women freeze. It was the soft whining of a dog, but it wasn't a sound of distress. It was gentle, almost musical, like a lullaby, and mixed with it, barely audible, was the cooing response of a contented baby. "Dear heavens," Margaret whispered, "there really is a baby in there." The two women stood at the gate, listening to this impossible duet between species, when they heard footsteps approaching. Turning, they saw two figures walking down Maple Street with the purposeful stride of people on a mission. The first was Robert Wilson, another retired teacher from Roosevelt Elementary. Behind him walked his walking companion, James Morrison, a former principal who had actually overseen the school's final years before closure. Both men were in their 70s, both still sharp as tacks, and both had maintained the habit of taking daily walks through their old neighborhood. "Ladies," Robert called out as he approached, "we couldn't help but notice you both standing here looking concerned. Everything all right?" Margaret and Mrs. Patterson exchanged glances. These were good men, trustworthy men who had devoted their lives to caring for children. If anyone would understand the gravity of their situation, it would be educators who had spent decades protecting and nurturing the young. "James," Margaret said carefully, "we have a situation that's going to sound impossible, but we need your help to figure out what to do about it." James Morrison, ever the administrator, immediately shifted into problem-solving mode. "What kind of situation?" Mrs. Patterson took a deep breath and told them everything. About the man in the expensive car, about the abandoned dog, about the mysterious baby, and about the extraordinary scene that had been unfolding in the old school all day. When she finished, both men were quiet for a long moment. Then James stepped closer to the fence and cupped his ear toward the building. After several minutes, his expression changed from skepticism to amazement. "I'll be damned," he said softly. "There really is something in there." Robert Wilson, who had taught second grade for 35 years and considered himself an expert on the sounds children make, nodded slowly. "That's definitely a baby, a young one, maybe 8 or 9 months old, and there's definitely a dog with him." "But how?" James wondered aloud. "How did a baby get inside that building? And why would someone abandon a child there?" "The same reason someone would abandon a sick dog, I imagine," Margaret said grimly. "Someone who doesn't understand the value of a life that depends on them." The four friends stood there as the afternoon light began to fade, each lost in their own thoughts about the impossible situation unfolding before them. They were all people who had spent their careers caring for others, and every instinct they possessed was screaming at them to act, yet something held them back. Some sense that this situation was beyond their understanding and required more than conventional solutions. As if summoned by their collective concern, a gentle breeze stirred the autumn leaves, and from within the building came the sound again, the dog's soft, protective whining and the baby's trusting response. It was a sound that spoke of comfort, of companionship, of two abandoned souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed most. "We can't just leave them in there overnight," Mrs. Patterson said finally. "That baby needs food, needs warmth, needs proper care. And that dog needs medical attention," Robert added. He sounded like he was in real distress this morning. James Morrison, drawing on decades of experience making difficult decisions, straightened his shoulders with resolve. "Then we go in, carefully, quietly, and with respect for whatever's happening in there." "But we go in," Margaret nodded, already mentally preparing for what they might find. "But we do this together, and we do it right. These aren't just a stray dog and an abandoned baby anymore. There's something else, something special. Whatever we do next, we need to honor that." As darkness began to fall over Cedar Falls, 4 retired educators prepared to enter Roosevelt Elementary School for the first time in over a decade. knowing that whatever they found inside would change everything they thought they knew about the bonds that can form between the most unlikely companions. The autumn evening air was crisp as the four retired educators made their way around the perimeter of Roosevelt Elementary, looking for the safest way to enter the building. Margaret Collins led the way, her familiarity with every corner of the school serving as their guide through the shadows cast by the setting sun. "There," she whispered, pointing to the same broken window near the kindergarten wing that the German Shepherd had used hours earlier. "That's our best option. The window's been broken for years, and it's low enough that we can get through without too much trouble." James Morrison, despite being the oldest of the group at 76, insisted on going first. "If there's any structural damage in there, I want to test it before anyone else goes through," he said, with the protective instincts of someone who had spent decades ensuring student safety. One by one, they carefully climbed through the window into the familiar yet strange environment of their old workplace. The smell hit them immediately, a mixture of dust, old paper, and something else they couldn't quite identify. It wasn't unpleasant, just deeply nostalgic and somehow sad. Robert Wilson pulled out a small flashlight and swept it across the kindergarten classroom. The beam revealed the ghostly remnants of educational life, faded alphabet letters still clinging to walls, tiny chairs stacked in corners, and reading books scattered across the floor, their pages warped by years of moisture and neglect. "This way," Margaret whispered, leading them toward the reading corner where she remembered hosting countless story times. No, the sounds were coming from over here. As they rounded the corner of a fallen bookshelf, their flashlight beams converged on a sight that none of them would ever forget. There, in what had once been the coziest corner of the classroom, the German Shepherd lay curled protectively around the baby, both of them sleeping peacefully despite their impossible circumstances. The dog's condition was immediately apparent and heartbreaking. His breathing was shallow and labored. His injured paw was clearly swollen, and his ribs showed through his dulled coat, yet his position was deliberately careful, creating a warm shelter for the infant with his body while keeping his weight off the child. The baby, somehow, looked remarkably well. He was clean, his clothes were in good condition, and he slept with the deep, trusting sleep of a child who felt completely safe. One tiny hand rested on the dog's chest, rising and falling with each labored breath. How is this possible?" Robert whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Look at them. That dog is clearly suffering, but he's protecting that baby like his own pup." Margaret knelt down carefully, close enough to observe but far enough away not to startle them. "The baby looks like he's been well cared for recently. These aren't the clothes of a child who's been abandoned for long." Mrs. Patterson, who had been quiet since entering the building, suddenly spoke up. "There," she said, pointing to a corner near where the pair slept. "There's more here than just what we're seeing." She was right. Scattered around their makeshift bed were items that clearly hadn't been there when the school was abandoned. A small blanket that looked handmade, a baby bottle that was empty but clean, and what appeared to be a small bag of dog treats, opened but not empty. James Morrison's administrative mind immediately began working through the implications. Someone brought that baby here deliberately, and they brought supplies for both the baby and the dog. This wasn't an abandonment in the usual sense. But who? Margaret wondered aloud. And why here? Why Roosevelt Elementary? As if summoned by their voices, the German Shepherd's eyes slowly opened. For a moment, he seemed confused, perhaps unsure whether these new humans represented safety or danger, but there was something in the gentle way they spoke, something in their careful, respectful approach that seemed to reassure him. The dog lifted his head slightly, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby, and looked at each of the four visitors in turn. His eyes, despite being clouded with pain and exhaustion, held an intelligence that was almost human in its depth. "Easy, boy," Robert said softly. extending his hand palm up in the universal gesture of peaceful intention. "We're here to help." The German Shepherd studied him for a long moment, then seemed to make a decision. His tail moved in the slightest of wags, just enough to signal that he understood these people meant no harm to him or his tiny charge. Margaret, drawing on decades of experience reading the needs of young children, observed the baby carefully. He's going to wake up soon and need feeding. And that dog needs medical attention that we can't provide here. So what do we do? Mrs. Patterson asked. We can't just leave them here, but we also can't just take them. There are legal issues, practical issues. Before anyone could answer, they heard footsteps outside the building. All four adults froze, their hearts pounding as they realized they were essentially trespassing, and their presence here would be difficult to explain to authorities. The footsteps came closer, and then they heard a voice calling out, "Hello, is someone in there? I saw the flashlight beams." James Morrison made a quick decision. "Stay here with them," he whispered to the others. "I'll go see who it is." He made his way back toward the broken window, and the others could hear him climbing through and then having a conversation with someone outside. The voices were too low to make out the words, but the tone seemed calm, not confrontational. A few minutes later, James returned, followed by someone they hadn't expected to see. Dr. Sarah Chen, the veterinarian who ran the Cedar Falls Animal Clinic, climbed carefully through the window with a medical bag in her hand. "Margaret told me you might need help," Dr. Chen said quietly as she approached the group. "James filled me in on the situation outside. I hope you don't mind that he called me." Margaret looked surprised. "Udim, when did you call her?" "I texted her while you three were studying our sleeping friends here," James admitted. "That dog clearly needs medical attention, and Dr. Chen has experience with both animals and the kind of unusual situations that require discretion." Dr. Chen knelt down near the German Shepherd, moving slowly and speaking in the gentle tones that had made her beloved by pet owners throughout Cedar Falls. "Hello there, beautiful boy. Let's see what's going on with you." The dog seemed to recognize her professional competence immediately. He remained alert, but allowed her to examine him, though he never moved far enough away from the baby to leave the child unprotected. "He's dehydrated and has what feels like a respiratory infection," Dr. Chen said quietly as she worked. "The limp is from an old injury that wasn't properly treated. He's been suffering for a while, but he's stable. With proper care, he should make a full recovery." As if responding to the discussion about his condition, the baby began to stir. His eyes opened slowly, and for a moment he seemed confused by the presence of so many new faces. But when he saw the German Shepherd still beside him, he smiled with the pure joy that only babies can express. The baby pushed himself up into a sitting position and looked around at the assembled adults with curious but unafraid eyes. Then he did something that made everyone in the room catch their breath. He reached over and patted the dog gently on the head, making soft, cooing sounds as if he were trying to comfort his protector. "My God," Dr. Chen whispered. "Look at that bond. That baby knows this dog saved him." Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched the interaction. "In all my years of teaching, I've never seen anything like this. The trust, the connection. It's like they're family." The baby, now fully awake and apparently deciding that these new people seemed friendly, began to babble happily. He reached toward Margaret with the universal gesture of a child who wants to be picked up. "May I?" Margaret asked, looking at Dr. Chen for guidance. "Go ahead," the veterinarian replied. "But slowly. Let's see how our guardian here reacts." Margaret carefully picked up the baby, and the German Shepherd watched every movement with intense focus. When the child settled comfortably in her arms and showed no signs of distress, the dog relaxed slightly, though his protective gaze never wavered. "He's been well cared for," Margaret observed as she held the baby. "His clothes are clean, he's well fed and hydrated, and he's clearly not afraid of people. Someone loves this child." Then why is he here? Robert asked. And why with an abandoned dog? Dr. Chen finished her examination of the German Shepherd and sat back on her heels. I've been thinking about that, she said. What if this wasn't really an abandonment? What if someone brought them both here because they thought this was the safest place for them to be? Safe from what? Mrs. Patterson asked. Before anyone could speculate further, the baby in Margaret's arms turned toward the broken window and pointed, babbling excitedly. They all looked in the direction he was pointing, but saw nothing except the gathering darkness outside. But the German Shepherd had heard something they hadn't. His ears perked up, and he struggled to get to his feet, despite his obvious discomfort. A low, protective growl rumbled in his chest, not threatening but clearly warning of approaching danger. "Someone's coming," James said, hearing footsteps outside that were different from Dr. Chen's earlier arrival. These footsteps were heavier, more purposeful, and there were several sets of them. The baby seemed to sense the tension in the room. He pressed closer to Margaret and made soft whimpering sounds, while the German Shepherd positioned himself between the group and the window, despite his injuries. "What do we do?" Mrs. Patterson whispered. Dr. Chen was already packing up her medical supplies. "We need to get them out of here, now. I don't know who's coming, but that dog's instincts are telling him it's not safe, and I trust those instincts completely." Margaret looked down at the baby in her arms, then at the suffering but brave dog who had protected him all day. Whatever was happening here was bigger than just an abandonment case, and somehow she knew that the safety of both these innocent lives now depended on the choices they made in the next few minutes. The footsteps outside Roosevelt Elementary grew closer, and the tension in the abandoned classroom was palpable. Dr. Chen quickly gathered her medical supplies, while Margaret held the baby protectively against her chest. The German Shepherd, despite his obvious pain, had positioned himself between the group and the entrance, his protective instincts overriding his physical limitations. "There's another way out," Margaret whispered urgently. "Through the back of the building, near the old teacher's lounge. I know these halls like the back of my hand." James Morrison nodded grimly. "Lead the way, quietly." As they prepared to move, Robert Wilson held up his hand for silence. The footsteps had stopped just outside the broken window, and they could hear low voices conferring. The words were indistinct, but the tone was businesslike, official. "Could be police," Mrs. Patterson whispered hopefully. Dr. Chen shook her head slightly. "That dog's reaction suggests otherwise. Animals have instincts about these things that we should trust." Margaret carefully adjusted her hold on the baby, who seemed to understand the need for quiet and remained unusually still in her arms. The German Shepherd looked up at her with what could only be described as gratitude, as if he knew she was now sharing the responsibility for the child's safety, moving as silently as possible. The group made their way through the maze of abandoned classrooms toward the back of the building. Margaret led them past the principal's office, where James had once worked, past the library, where Robert had brought countless classes for story time, and toward the teacher's lounge that had been their sanctuary during lunch breaks and planning periods. As they walked, the baby reached out and touched the German Shepherd's head whenever the dog came close enough. Despite his injuries and the stress of the situation, the dog seemed to draw strength from the child's touch, his steps becoming slightly steadier. They had almost reached the back exit when they heard the sound of the intruders entering the building through the same broken window they had used. Footsteps echoed through the empty hallways, and flashlight beams swept across walls and doorways. "They know exactly where to look," James observed in a whisper. "And this isn't a random search." Dr. Chen paused at the emergency exit door, testing it carefully. "It's stuck, but I think we can get it open. The question is whether the alarm still works." "It's been disconnected for years," Margaret assured her. "Budget cuts." With a collective effort, they managed to force the door open just enough for everyone to slip through. The German Shepherd went last, clearly reluctant to leave until he was certain his human family was safe. They found themselves in the overgrown area behind the school, where nature had begun to reclaim what had once been a carefully maintained playground. The autumn night was cold, and the baby shivered slightly in Margaret's arms. "My house," Mrs. Patterson said immediately. "It's closest, and we can figure out what to do from there." As they made their way through the shadows toward Mrs. Patterson's home, Dr. Chen stayed close to the German Shepherd, monitoring his condition. The stress and exertion were clearly taking a toll on him, but his determination to stay with the baby seemed to give him reserves of strength he shouldn't have possessed. Once safely inside Mrs. Patterson's warm kitchen, the group could finally catch their breath and assess their situation. Margaret settled into a comfortable chair with the baby, who immediately began looking around with the bright curiosity of a healthy infant. Mrs. Patterson busied herself making coffee and gathering some crackers and fruit, while Dr. Chen conducted a more thorough examination of the German Shepherd. "His condition is serious, but not immediately life-threatening," she reported. "The respiratory infection needs treatment, and he's clearly been undernourished for some time. But what's remarkable is his emotional state. Despite everything he's been through, he's focused entirely on protecting that baby." Robert Wilson, who had been quiet during their escape, finally spoke up. "I've been thinking about what we saw back there. The supplies, the careful arrangement, the fact that someone knew exactly where to look for them. This wasn't a simple abandonment." James nodded thoughtfully. "Someone placed them there deliberately, and someone else knew exactly where they were. The question is whether the second group had good intentions or bad ones." The baby, comfortable in Margaret's lap, began to babble and reach toward the German Shepherd, who had settled on the kitchen floor where he could keep an eye on everyone. Despite his exhaustion, the dog's tail moved slightly whenever the child made noise. "Look at them," Mrs. Patterson said softly as she poured coffee. "That bond isn't something that formed overnight. They've known each other for a while." Dr. Chen sat back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know, there's something about this dog that's been nagging at me. His breed, his training, his behavior. He's not just any German Shepherd. He's been professionally trained, probably for protection work." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. "Watch how he positions himself. He's always between potential threats and the baby. But he never blocks escape routes. He's alert to sounds we can't even hear, and his protective instincts are incredibly refined. This is a dog who was trained to guard someone important." As if to prove her point, the German Shepherd suddenly lifted his head and looked toward the front window. A moment later, they all heard the sound of a car driving slowly past the house. The dog remained alert until the sound faded completely, then settled back down. "So if he's a protection dog," Robert mused, "and that baby has clearly been in his care for some time, then someone with means, someone who could afford professional protection, had them both," James finished, "and for some reason felt the need to hide them." Margaret looked down at the baby in her arms, noting details she hadn't paid attention to before. His clothes, while simple, were high quality. His shoes were expensive brand names. Even his blanket showed signs of careful craftsmanship. "This child comes from money," she said quietly. "Everything about him suggests privilege, careful care, resources." Mrs. Patterson joined them at the kitchen table with a plate of crackers and some fruit. So why would someone with that kind of background end up hiding in an abandoned school with an injured dog? Before anyone could answer, the baby reached toward the German Shepherd and said something that made everyone freeze. It wasn't quite a word, but it was clearly an attempt at one, and it sounded distinctly like Max. The German Shepherd's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His ears perked up, his eyes brightened, and for the first time since they'd found him, his tail wagged with something approaching joy. Max. Margaret repeated softly. And again the dog responded with enthusiasm despite his exhaustion. Well, at least we know his name now, Dr. Chen smiled. Max, you're quite the hero, aren't you, boy? Max struggled to his feet and approached Margaret and the baby, his tail now wagging steadily despite his obvious discomfort. The baby laughed with delight and reached out to pat Max's nose, clearly thrilled to have his friend close by. They're not just bonded, Mrs. Patterson observed. They're a team. That baby knows Max's name. And Max responds to the baby's voice like he's been doing it for months. Dr. Chen pulled out her phone and showed it to the group. I've been thinking we should document this, not for any official purpose, but because what we're witnessing is remarkable. The bond between them, Max's condition and recovery, the baby's development. This is a story that needs to be preserved. She took several photos of Max and the baby together, capturing the gentle way the dog positioned himself so the child could lean against him, and the trusting way the baby rested his head on Max's side. The question now, James said, bringing them back to the practical reality of their situation, is what do we do next? We can't keep them here indefinitely. But we also can't just turn them over to authorities without understanding what we'd be putting them into. Margaret looked out the kitchen window toward Roosevelt Elementary, where lights could still be seen moving through the building. Those people are still searching. They haven't given up. Which means, Robert added grimly, that whatever situation led to Max and this baby being hidden in that school, it's not over. Doctor. Chen finished her coffee and stood up. I need to get back to my clinic to get proper medication for Max. His condition is stable, but he needs antibiotics and pain management. I also have a colleague who specializes in unusual animal behavior cases. She might have insights into protection dogs and the kind of training Max has clearly received. The baby, who had been contentedly babbling and playing with Max's ears, suddenly grew quiet and looked toward the front door. Max immediately went on alert, his protective instincts engaged despite his exhaustion. This time, they all heard it. A car had pulled up outside Mrs. Patterson's house, and car doors were closing quietly in the night. Back door, Mrs. Patterson said immediately. There's a path through my garden that leads to the Hendersons' yard, and from there you can get to Dr. Chen's clinic without being seen from the street. Margaret stood up with the baby, who seemed to sense the urgency and remained remarkably calm. Max struggled to his feet, clearly prepared to follow wherever his charges were going. Wait, James said, moving to the front window and peering carefully through the curtains. It's not the same people who were at the school. They all froze, watching as James observed whoever had arrived outside. It's a woman, he reported quietly. She's alone, and she's just sitting in her car. She looks like she's crying. The baby in Margaret's arms suddenly became agitated, making urgent sounds and reaching toward the front of the house. Max, despite his injuries, moved to the window and began to whine softly. Not in distress, but in what sounded like recognition. Oh my God, Mrs. Patterson whispered, realization dawning on her face. But I think that might be his mother. The kitchen fell silent, except for the baby's increasingly urgent sounds and Max's soft whining as they both seemed to recognize the woman sitting in the car outside. Margaret held the child closer, feeling his little body tense with what appeared to be excitement rather than fear. Should we go out there? Mrs. Patterson asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James Morrison, ever cautious, shook his head. Not yet. We need to understand what's happening first. If she's really the mother, why isn't she coming to the door? Why is she just sitting there? Dr. Chen moved carefully to another window to get a different angle on the scene outside. She's on her phone now, she reported quietly, and she keeps looking at the house, but also checking her rearview mirror like she's watching for someone else. The baby in Margaret's arms began to fuss more insistently, and Max struggled to his feet despite his obvious pain. The dog positioned himself by the front door, tail wagging weakly but persistently, clearly wanting to go to the woman outside. "These two definitely know her," Robert observed, "but something's keeping her from just coming up and knocking on the door." Mrs. Patterson made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "I'm going out there. If she's that baby's mother, and she's in some kind of trouble, then sitting here speculating isn't helping anyone." Before the others could protest, she had moved to the front door and opened it slightly. "Miss," she called out softly, "are you looking for someone?" The woman in the car looked up sharply, and even in the dim streetlight, they could see her face was streaked with tears. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with long, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and wearing jeans and a sweater that looked like they'd been slept in. "Please," the woman called back, her voice breaking, "I know this sounds crazy, but do you have my baby and Max? I saw the lights earlier and I've been driving around all night trying to find them." The baby heard his mother's voice and began to cry, not in distress but in the urgent, demanding way babies cry when they want something desperately. Max began to pace by the door, his tail wagging despite his exhaustion. Mrs. Patterson looked back at the others, who nodded their agreement. "Yes, they're here, but before we do anything else, we need to understand what's happening. Are you safe? Are they safe?" The young woman got out of her car but remained by the driver's side door, clearly prepared to leave quickly if necessary. "My name is Amanda Rodriguez," she called out. "That's my son, Tyler. And Max has been protecting him since I had to leave him there." "You left him?" Margaret asked, having moved to the doorway with Tyler in her arms. At the sight of his mother, the baby began reaching toward her urgently. Amanda's composure crumbled completely. "I didn't want to, God. I never wanted to leave my baby. But it was the only way to keep him safe until I could figure out what to do." Dr. Chen stepped forward, her professional demeanor helping to calm the emotionally charged situation. "Amanda, I'm Dr. Chen. I've been taking care of Max, and these folks have been helping with Tyler. Why don't you come inside so we can talk about this properly?" Amanda hesitated, looking up and down the street nervously. "Are you sure it's safe? If certain people find out where Tyler is, safer than standing out here in the open," James pointed out gently. "And your son clearly needs his mother." That did it. Amanda locked her car and hurried up the walkway to Mrs. Patterson's front door. The moment she stepped inside, Tyler began babbling excitedly and reaching for her, while Max, despite his injuries, managed to approach her with his tail wagging. "Oh, Max," Amanda whispered, kneeling down to pet the German Shepherd despite Tyler's urgent demands for attention. "I'm so sorry, boy. I'm so sorry I couldn't take you with me." Margaret carefully transferred Tyler to his mother's arms, and the reunion was immediate and intense. The baby settled against Amanda like he was finally home, while she held him as if she'd never let him go again. "Now," Dr. Chen said gently, once Amanda had settled into a chair with Tyler, "can you help us understand what's been happening? Max is clearly a protection dog. Tyler has obviously been well cared for. And yet you felt the need to hide them in an abandoned school. What were you protecting them from?" Amanda took a deep breath, stroking Tyler's hair as she gathered her thoughts. "I worked for Richard Blackwood. He owns Blackwood Industries. You might have seen the name on buildings around the state. He's very wealthy, very powerful, and very used to getting what he wants." The adults in the room exchanged glances. They all knew the name Blackwood Industries. It was on half the commercial developments in North Carolina. "I was his personal assistant," Amanda continued. "At first, it was a great job. Good pay, interesting work, and Mr. Blackwood seemed like a decent person. But then things changed between us. He started paying too much attention to me, making comments, asking me to work late when it wasn't necessary." Margaret felt her heart sink as the picture became clearer. "He was inappropriate with you. More than inappropriate, Amanda said quietly, her arms tightening around Tyler. He made it clear that my job security depended on my cooperation. When I refused, he threatened to ruin my career, make sure I could never get another decent job anywhere in the state. Robert Wilson's face darkened with anger. And Tyler is his son, Amanda confirmed. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought he might do the right thing. Instead, he offered me money to disappear, to give up any claim to him as the father. When I refused that too, he got dangerous. Dr. Chen leaned forward. Dangerous how? He has people who do things for him. Intimidation, mostly. But I started getting followed, having my apartment broken into, getting threatening phone calls. He wanted me to sign papers giving up all parental rights and agreeing never to contact him or Tyler again. But you didn't sign, James said. I couldn't. Tyler is my son. But I also couldn't keep him safe while Blackwood's people were constantly watching me. So I came up with a plan. Amanda looked down at Max, who had settled at her feet despite his obvious discomfort. Max was supposed to be Blackwood's protection dog, but he ended up bonding with Tyler and me instead. When I realized I needed to disappear for a while, I knew Max would protect Tyler better than anyone else could. So you took them both to the school, Mrs. Patterson said, understanding dawning. I knew that building from when I was a kid. I used to play there sometimes before it was completely sealed up. I thought it would be safe for a few days while I figured out how to get help. Maybe find a lawyer who wasn't afraid of Richard Blackwood's influence. Margaret looked puzzled. But Amanda, why didn't you just go to the police or child services? Amanda's laugh was bitter. Richard Blackwood donates millions to political campaigns. He sits on boards of directors with half the judges in the state. His golf buddies include the district attorney and the police commissioner. Who was I going to call? A 22-year-old single mother with no resources against one of the most powerful men in North Carolina. The room fell quiet as everyone absorbed the magnitude of what Amanda had been facing. Tyler, sensing his mother's distress, reached up to pat her cheek with his tiny hand. But something went wrong with your plan, Dr. Chen observed. See, Max ended up abandoned at the school instead of just hidden there. Amanda's expression grew angry for the first time since they'd been talking. Richard found out somehow. He had his driver take Max away this morning, just drove him to the school and left him there like he was garbage. I think he was trying to send me a message that he could take Tyler away just as easily. That's why those people were searching the school tonight, Robert realized. They were looking for Tyler. Probably, Amanda agreed. But I've been watching from a distance all day. When I saw that Max was hurt and Tyler was missing from where I'd left him, I panicked. I've been driving around all evening trying to figure out where they could be. Mrs. Patterson reached over and patted Amanda's hand. Well, they're safe now. Max protected Tyler all day, and we found them together. But for how long? Amanda asked desperately. Richard has resources I can't compete with. How do I protect my son from someone like that? Dr. Chen stood up and moved to check on Max again. Amanda, you've been trying to handle this alone, but you don't have to anymore. What's happened here today has created something Richard Blackwood probably never expected. What do you mean? Margaret smiled, looking around at her fellow retired educators. You've got witnesses now, people who saw Max's condition, who can testify to his abandonment, people who found Tyler and can speak to his circumstances. And more importantly, you've got people who care about what happens to both of you. James Morrison nodded firmly. We're all retired, so we don't have to worry about career consequences. And we're all old enough to be stubborn about doing what's right. Plus, Dr. Chen added, I have medical documentation of Max's condition and treatment. If Richard Blackwood abandoned a valuable protection dog in the condition Max was in, that's animal cruelty at minimum. Amanda looked around the room at these people who had become Tyler and Max's protectors, and for the first time in months, She felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. Tyler, comfortable in his mother's arms but clearly tired from his adventure, began to drowse against her shoulder. Max, despite his injuries, positioned himself where he could keep watch over both mother and child, his protective instincts as strong as ever. "So, what do we do now?" Amanda asked quietly. Mrs. Patterson smiled at the young woman and her baby. "Now, dear, we fight back, but we do it smart, and we do it together." The next morning dawned crisp and clear over Cedar Falls, and Mrs. Patterson's kitchen had been transformed into an unlikely war room. Amanda sat at the table with Tyler on her lap, while Max rested nearby, already looking better after Dr. Chen's overnight medical attention. The retired educators had spent the night researching, planning, and calling in favors from their extensive network of former colleagues and community connections. Margaret Collins spread out a series of printed articles and photos across the kitchen table. "I spent half the night researching Richard Blackwood," she announced, "and what I found is very interesting. Our Mr. Blackwood isn't quite the upstanding citizen he pretends to be." James Morrison looked up from his laptop, where he'd been typing steadily for hours. "I've been working on documentation. Everything that happened yesterday, the condition we found Max in, Tyler's situation, Amanda's story, it's all been recorded with dates, times, and witness statements." Dr. Chen finished checking Max's bandages and joined them at the table. "I also called my colleague in Raleigh, the one who specializes in protection dogs. She's very interested in Max's case. Apparently, German Shepherds with his level of training are worth upwards of $50,000. Abandoning him the way Blackwood did isn't just cruel, it's destruction of valuable property." Amanda looked hopeful for the first time since her ordeal began. "But will any of that matter against someone with Blackwood's resources and connections?" Robert Wilson smiled grimly. "That's where you underestimate the power of retired teachers, my dear. We may not have money or political connections, but we have something much more valuable. We have students. Lots and lots of former students who are now adults in positions throughout this state." Margaret nodded enthusiastically. "I taught elementary school for 30 years. James was a principal for 25 years. Robert taught for 35 years. Between the three of us, we've influenced thousands of children who are now grown up and working as lawyers, journalists, social workers, police officers, and yes, even judges. We started making calls at 5 this morning," James added. "Carefully, quietly, but persistently. And what we're finding is that Richard Blackwood has made enemies over the years, people who've been waiting for the right opportunity to hold him accountable." Dr. Chen pulled out her phone and showed them a series of text messages. "I also reached out to the local media. There's a young reporter at the Cedar Falls Gazette named Michael Torres. He's been investigating Blackwood Industries for months, looking into their business practices and treatment of employees." Amanda shifted Tyler to her other arm, hope and fear warring in her expression. "You think people will actually help us?" "Honey," Mrs. Patterson said gently, "people have been helping you since yesterday without even knowing the full story. Look around this table. None of us had ever met you before last night, but we all spent our night working to protect you and Tyler." As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Patterson went to answer it and returned with a woman in her 50s wearing a professional suit and carrying a briefcase. She had kind eyes and a confident demeanor that immediately put Amanda at ease. "Amanda, I'd like you to meet Susan Martinez," Margaret said. "She was one of my students 25 years ago. She's now a family law attorney who specializes in cases involving powerful defendants." Susan settled into a chair and opened her briefcase. "Margaret filled me in on the basics this morning. Amanda, I want you to know that what's happened to you is unacceptable, and there are legal remedies available. The fact that you have witnesses to the abandonment of both Max and essentially Tyler makes this a much stronger case than you might think." But won't Blackwood's lawyers just overwhelm us? Amanda asked. Susan smiled. Richard Blackwood's usual legal strategy relies on intimidation and the assumption that his opponents don't have resources to fight back. What he's not expecting is a coordinated response from people who can't be bought or intimidated. Retired teachers have a reputation for being remarkably stubborn when they believe in something. Tyler, who had been contentedly playing with a soft toy Mrs. Patterson had found, suddenly looked toward the door and made happy, babbling sounds. Max, despite his injuries, immediately went on alert, but in a positive way, tail wagging, ears up. "That's strange," Amanda said. "He only does that when he recognizes someone he likes." The doorbell rang again, and this time James went to answer it. He returned with a young man in his 30s, wearing jeans and a jacket, carrying a camera and a notebook. "This is Michael Torres from the Gazette," James announced. "And I think Tyler recognizes him because Michael has been doing some very interesting investigative work." Michael sat down and pulled out his notebook. "Amanda, I've been investigating Blackwood Industries for 6 months now. You're not the first employee who's complained about Richard Blackwood's behavior, but you might be the first one willing to go on record about it." Amanda looked surprised. "There are others?" "At least 3 that I know of," Michael confirmed. "All young women, all in support positions, all threatened when they refused his advances or tried to report his behavior. But they were all too afraid to speak publicly because of his influence and resources." Susan leaned forward with interest. "Have any of them been willing to provide statements?" "They might be now," Michael said. "The difference with Amanda's case is that it involves a child, and it involves documented animal cruelty. Those are elements that make the story much more compelling to both the public and to prosecutors." Dr. Chen spoke up. "And I have detailed medical records of Max's condition when we found him. The level of neglect and the deliberate nature of his abandonment are clear from a veterinary standpoint. And we have multiple witnesses to the entire sequence of events," Robert added. "Plus, we have documentation of Tyler's circumstances and Amanda's credible testimony about the threats she received." Amanda looked around the table at all these people who had rallied to help her and Tyler. "No, I can't believe you're all doing this for us. We're strangers to you." Margaret reached over and squeezed her hand. "Honey, the moment we saw that baby with Max in that school, you stopped being strangers. You became our responsibility." Michael Torres was taking notes rapidly. "Amanda, if you're willing to go on record, I'd like to write this story, but I want to do it right, with full documentation and corroboration. The goal isn't just to expose what Blackwood did to you, it's to make sure he can't do it to anyone else." Tyler chose that moment to reach toward Max, who carefully approached the table despite his bandaged paw. The baby giggled with delight as Max gently nuzzled his hand, and the bond between them was clearly as strong as ever. "Look at that," Susan said softly. "That dog has been protecting your son like he was his own pup. That level of loyalty and protectiveness is remarkable. Max was supposed to be Blackwood's protection dog," Amanda explained. "But from the moment Tyler was born, Max seemed to understand that the baby was the one who really needed protecting." Dr. Chen nodded. "That's actually not uncommon with properly trained protection dogs. They have incredible instincts about who truly needs their protection." James looked up from his laptop again. "Good, I've been working on something while we've been talking. I've drafted a letter to the district attorney's office, signed by all of us as witnesses and concerned citizens. It details everything we observed yesterday and requests a formal investigation into animal cruelty charges against Richard Blackwood." "Will they actually investigate?" Amanda asked. Susan smiled. "When the complaint comes from a group of respected retired educators, includes medical documentation from a licensed veterinarian, and involves a case that's already gaining media attention, yes, they'll investigate." Michael Torres closed his notebook and looked directly at Amanda. The story is going to come out one way or another. Blackwood's treatment of employees, his business practices, his abuse of power, it's all going to be exposed eventually. The question is whether you want to be part of taking control of that narrative, or whether you want to let him continue to dictate the terms. Amanda looked down at Tyler, who was now dozing peacefully in her arms, completely trusting that the adults around him would keep him safe. Max had positioned himself at her feet, his protective instincts intact despite his exhaustion. "He threatened to take Tyler away from me," she said quietly. "He said he had the resources to prove I was an unfit mother, that no court would give custody to someone like me over someone like him." "Someone like him," Margaret repeated with disgust. "You mean someone who abandons a sick animal, someone who threatens a young mother, someone who uses his wealth to intimidate people who can't fight back?" Susan opened her briefcase and pulled out a series of documents. "Amanda, I've prepared some paperwork that will help protect you and Tyler immediately. Restraining orders, our custody documentation, formal complaints. But the most important thing is that you're not alone anymore." Tyler stirred in his mother's arms and opened his eyes, looking around at all the faces surrounding him with curious contentment. When he saw Max, he made soft cooing sounds, and the German shepherd's tail thumped gently against the floor. "You know what I think," Mrs. Patterson said, looking at the unlikely family they'd all become invested in protecting. "I think Richard Blackwood made a serious mistake when he underestimated what would happen when he left Max and Tyler at Roosevelt Elementary." "What do you mean?" Amanda asked. Robert Wilson smiled. "He probably thought he was teaching you a lesson about how powerless you are against him. Instead, he brought together a group of people who have spent their careers protecting children and who have no intention of letting him get away with this." "Doctor." Chen stood up and checked Max one more time. His fever's completely gone, and the swelling in his paw is already reducing. With proper care, he's going to make a full recovery. "And Tyler," Margaret added, looking at the baby who was now babbling happily in his mother's arms, "is clearly thriving despite everything he's been through. That's a testament to both his mother's love and Max's protection." Michael Torres gathered his notes and camera. "I'm going to start working on the story immediately, but Amanda, I want you to know that this isn't just about exposing Richard Blackwood. This is about showing that ordinary people can stand up to power when they work together." Susan packed up her legal documents. "I'll file the initial paperwork this afternoon. By tomorrow, there will be legal protections in place for both you and Tyler." As their impromptu support team began to disperse to work on their various tasks, Amanda found herself alone with Mrs. Patterson, Margaret, Robert, and James. Tyler was sleeping peacefully, and Max had settled into what was clearly becoming his favorite spot at her feet. "I don't know how to thank you all," Amanda said, tears in her eyes. "Yesterday morning, I thought Tyler and I were completely alone against impossible odds." Margaret smiled warmly. "Honey, you were never alone. You just hadn't found your community yet. And now that you have, Richard Blackwood is about to discover that there are some fights he can't win with money and intimidation." Mrs. Patterson looked out the window toward Roosevelt Elementary, where this whole adventure had begun less than 24 hours earlier. "You know, that old school has been empty for years, but yesterday it served its most important purpose ever. It brought together people who needed each other." Tyler stirred in his sleep and unconsciously reached down toward Max, who gently moved closer so the baby's hand could rest on his fur. Even in sleep, the bond between them remained strong. "Tomorrow," James said with satisfaction, "Richard Blackwood is going to wake up to a very different world than the one he went to sleep in tonight." 3 months later, the autumn leaves had given way to the first snows of winter, and Cedar Falls looked like a picture postcard with its tree-lined streets dusted in white. But the most dramatic transformation wasn't in the landscape. It was in the lives of the people whose paths had crossed at Roosevelt Elementary on that fateful September morning. Amanda Rodriguez stood in the doorway of what had once been the abandoned school's main office, watching as workers put the finishing touches on the renovation. The building was being transformed into the Roosevelt Community Center, a place dedicated to supporting families in crisis and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Tyler, now a confident 11-month-old, sat in his stroller babbling excitedly at Max, who had made a remarkable recovery and was back to his full strength and protective instincts. The German Shepherd wore a special vest identifying him as a certified therapy dog, a new role that suited his gentle nature perfectly. "It's hard to believe how much has changed," Amanda said to Margaret Collins, who was standing beside her reviewing the final plans for the center's programs. Margaret smiled, watching Tyler clap his hands with delight as Max performed a gentle trick for him. Sometimes the most important changes happen when we least expect them. The past 3 months had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and community support. Michael Torres's investigative series on Richard Blackwood and Blackwood Industries had won a state journalism award and had prompted investigations by multiple agencies. The revelation that Amanda wasn't Blackwood's only victim had led to a domino effect of women coming forward with their own stories. Susan Martinez approached them with a folder of documents and a satisfied expression. "The final paperwork came through this morning. Richard Blackwood has agreed to all the terms of the settlement. He'll be paying for Tyler's education through college, providing medical insurance for both of you, and contributing significantly to the Roosevelt Community Center endowment." "And the custody situation?" Amanda asked, though she already knew the answer from Susan's smile. "Complete and permanent custody to you, with no visitation rights for him. The court was very clear that his pattern of behavior made him unfit for any parental role. Plus, his legal troubles are far from over. The criminal charges for animal cruelty are proceeding, and the Labor Department's investigation into his business practices is ongoing." Dr. Chen joined their group, having just finished a checkup on Max in the center's new veterinary clinic space. "Max is in perfect health," she announced. "His recovery has been remarkable, but I think that has more to do with having a purpose and a family than with my medical treatment." As if he understood he was being talked about, Max stood up and moved to Tyler's stroller, positioning himself where the baby could reach down and pat his head. Tyler giggled and said something that sounded remarkably like "Max," which never failed to make the dog's tail wag with pride. Mrs. Patterson and Robert Wilson approached from the main entrance, followed by James Morrison, who was using a cane now but insisted he was just being cautious on the snowy sidewalks. "The dedication ceremony is about to begin," Mrs. Patterson announced. "Are you ready for this, Amanda?" Amanda looked around at these people who had become her chosen family, at her son, who was thriving in the loving environment they'd all created together, and at Max, who had started as Tyler's protector but had become so much more. "I think I am," she said, straightening her shoulders with the confidence that had grown steadily over the past months. The main room of the Roosevelt Community Center was packed with people from throughout Cedar Falls and beyond. There were former students of Margaret, Robert, and James, colleagues of Dr. Chen, readers of Michael Torres's journalism, and families who had already begun to benefit from the center's services. But perhaps the most significant attendees were the 3 other women who had come forward with their own stories about Richard Blackwood. They sat together in the front row, their presence a powerful reminder that speaking truth to power was possible when people supported each other. Amanda took the podium with Tyler in her arms and Max at her side. The room fell quiet as she looked out at the faces of people who had transformed from strangers into community. 3 months ago, she began, I thought I was powerless against someone who had more money, more influence, and more resources than I could ever hope to have. I was wrong about being powerless, but I was right about one thing. I couldn't fight him alone. Tyler babbled something and reached toward the audience, making several people chuckle. Tyler and Max taught me something important that day at the old Roosevelt Elementary, Amanda continued. They showed me that protection isn't about size or strength or resources. It's about love, commitment, and the willingness to stand between danger and the people you care about. She looked down at Max, who was sitting perfectly still but alert, his professional training evident even in this relaxed setting. Max was supposed to protect someone who didn't deserve protection. Instead, he chose to protect someone who truly needed it. That choice changed all of our lives. Margaret Collins stepped forward to take the microphone. As educators, we always believed that the most important lessons aren't taught in classrooms. They're learned through experience. What we've all learned over these past months is that community isn't something you're born into. It's something you create by choosing to care about each other. Robert Wilson joined her at the podium. This community center isn't just about providing services to families in need. It's about creating a place where stories like Amanda's and Tyler's don't have to end in isolation and fear. Dr. Chen added her voice to the dedication. From a professional standpoint, I've learned that healing isn't just about medical treatment. Max's recovery happened because he had a purpose and a family. The same is true for all of us. We heal better when we're connected to something larger than ourselves. James Morrison, ever the administrator, even in retirement, stepped forward with a practical announcement. The Roosevelt Community Center will officially open its doors for services next Monday. We'll be offering family counseling, legal aid clinics, childcare for working parents, and a therapy dog program coordinated by our very own Max here. As if he knew he was being introduced, Max stood up and gave a gentle woof that made Tyler clap with delight and brought applause from the audience. Michael Torres, who had been documenting the ceremony for the newspaper, approached the podium. I've been a journalist for 10 years, and I've covered a lot of stories about people overcoming difficult circumstances, but this story is different because it shows what's possible when ordinary people decide to do extraordinary things for each other. Mrs. Patterson, who had started it all by simply paying attention to what was happening across the street, took the microphone last. 3 months ago, I was just a retired woman tending her garden when I witnessed something that could have been a tragedy. Instead, it became a miracle because a group of people decided that protecting Tyler and Max was more important than staying safe and comfortable. She looked directly at Amanda. Dear, you asked us once why we were helping you when you were strangers to us. The answer is simple. You stopped being strangers the moment we saw that you needed help. That's what community means. The formal ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a plaque near the main entrance. It read, "The Roosevelt Community Center, where every soul matters and no one stands alone, dedicated to Tyler, Max, and the power of unexpected families." As people began to mingle and explore the new facilities, Amanda found herself standing in the same spot where they had first discovered Tyler and Max together. The space had been transformed into a bright, welcoming playroom for children, but she could still remember exactly how it had looked that September morning. Tyler was now walking with the determined wobble of a toddler who had recently mastered the skill, and Max followed him carefully, ready to provide support if needed. Their bond had only grown stronger over the months, and Max had proven to be not just Tyler's protector, but his patient playmate and constant companion. Margaret approached with a photo album in her hands. "I've been documenting Tyler's progress and Max's recovery," she said, opening the album to show pictures from that first day to the present. "I thought you might like to have these." The first picture showed Max and Tyler sleeping together in the abandoned classroom, two abandoned souls who had found each other. The last picture, taken just that morning, showed Tyler taking his first steps while Max walked beside him, both of them healthy, happy, and surrounded by people who loved them. "It's like looking at a completely different life," Amanda said, tears in her eyes as she flipped through the photos. Dr. Chen joined them with an update on Max's therapy dog certification. He's exceeded every expectation. The trainers say they've never seen a dog with such natural instincts for providing comfort and protection. He's going to help a lot of people through this program. Susan Martinez approached with final legal documents. Everything is settled now. Tyler's college fund is established, your housing is secure, and you have full legal protection. Richard Blackwood will never be able to threaten you or Tyler again. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Amanda found herself standing outside Roosevelt Elementary, now the Roosevelt Community Center, with the small group of people who had become her family. Tyler was asleep in his stroller, and Max was resting beside them, alert but relaxed. "You know," James said thoughtfully, "this building has been serving children for almost 60 years. First as a school and now as a community center. There's something fitting about that." Robert nodded. "Education doesn't stop when you graduate. The most important lessons often come from life experience, from the choices we make when no one is forcing us to make them." Mrs. Patterson looked up at the building where it all began. "I think about that morning sometimes, about what would have happened if I had just called the authorities right away, instead of waiting to see what developed. Tyler and Max might have been separated," Margaret said. "Amanda might never have gotten the support she needed to fight back. The community might never have discovered what Richard Blackwood was really like." Dr. Chen added, "And we all might have missed the chance to be part of something really meaningful." Amanda looked around at these people who had changed her life and Tyler's future. "I used to think that family was something you were born into, something you had no choice about. Now I know that the best families are the ones you choose, and who choose you back." Tyler stirred in his sleep and reached down toward Max, who gently moved closer so the toddler's hand could rest on his fur. Even in sleep, the bond between them remained constant. As they prepared to go their separate ways for the evening, Amanda realized that this wasn't really an ending at all. It was a beginning of Tyler's life in a community that would support and protect him, of Max's new career helping other people heal, and of her own future in a place where she truly belonged. The snow continued to fall gently on Cedar Falls, covering the town in a blanket of peace and possibility. Roosevelt Elementary had found its new purpose, and the unlikely family that had been formed in its abandoned halls had found their way home. 6 months later, Amanda would graduate from the community college with a degree in social work, inspired by the people who had helped her to help others facing similar challenges. Tyler would take his first real steps on the playground behind the community center, with Max right beside him as always. And the Roosevelt Community Center would become a model for similar programs throughout the state, proving that sometimes the most powerful change starts with ordinary people deciding to care about each other. But that September morning, when a sick dog and an abandoned baby found each other in an empty school, none of them could have imagined how far their story would reach, or how many lives would be touched by their example of unexpected love and unwavering protection. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Amanda, Tyler, and Max has touched your hearts and shown you the incredible power of community and compassion. This tale reminds us that heroes come in all forms, sometimes as a loyal dog protecting a baby, sometimes as retired teachers who refuse to look away from injustice, and sometimes as ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things for others. If this story moved you, we have prepared a special playlist filled with equally captivating stories of hope, resilience, and the bonds that connect us all. You can find it by clicking to your left. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the complexity of life and the beauty of human connection. Don't miss our upcoming content, and we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Share your thoughts about Amanda and Tyler's journey, or tell us about a time when unexpected help came into your life. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most powerful families are the ones we choose, and that no act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever wasted.